when Michael suggested to me that he wanted the topic to be negative economics, he explained to me that he was going to talk about what he just had, the fact that most economists advise that austerity is good for you. Negative economics has become anti-labor, it's become anti-government, and increasingly, by supporting the financial sector, it's become even anti-industrial. But I'm going to talk about negative economics in a different sense, and it may seem to be a more philosophical sense. It's the literal sense of the area that I work in, which is financial economics. As you know, most of my writing is about debt. And the easiest way to think of debt is that's the negative, the liability side of the balance sheet. You can think of almost any economic activity in terms of a balance sheet. For instance, one of the best things about canceling the debts is you cancel the savings on the other side of it. One person's debt is another person's savings. Well, that sounds just sort of like maybe a boring tautology. But for the modern economy, the debt of the 99% of Americans are the savings of the 1%. So as Lenin would say, the whole economics should be whom. Now, when I begin to teach economics at the New School, not a single economist had ever studied accounting. And most economics simply focuses on the means of production, on assets, on people, on capital goods. There's no concept of the negative side of the balance sheet. And yet, what the distinguishing feature of today's economy is that the negative side of the balance sheet is becoming stronger than the positive side. The liability side is stronger. That's why you have bankruptcies. That's why Obama said, let's have 10,000 forfeitures. The debts have to be paid. My constituency has to pay the debts to my donors. That's basically negative economics, literally, in a nutshell. So people usually calculate wealth, and when Adam Smith wrote The Wealth of Nations, or when the media talk about the American economy, they talk about the tangible means of productions. They talk about factories, they talk about agriculture, farms and fields, transportation, and yet if you look at what is the value of all this wealth, how do people value the wealth, it's all on the negative side of the balance sheet. It's stocks and bonds and property claims. And real estate, property claim is largely a negative claim. It means that someone who rents the property owes something to you, or somebody who buys a home owes something to you. So stocks, bonds, and real estate are all part of the negative economy, and this is the sector that is dominating American politics, and it's dominated economies ever since ancient Greece and Rome, not Babylonian Sumer, as we'll get to. Now, the problem is that the negative side of the balance sheet is taking over the positive side. You've seen before the statement by the Harvard economist Les Koenig that of all of the profits, the cash flow of the Standard & Poor 500 in the last 10 years, 92% have been spent on dividend payments to the stockholders and on stock buybacks to benefit the stockholders. Only 8% has actually gone into the positive economics. Most of the growth that you hear about in GDP, when the numbers come out for gross domestic product, it's all by the FIRE sector. And in the work that I'm doing in Washington with Gar Alperovitz's group that we'll be talking about at 10 o'clock tomorrow morning, we found that the more rapidly GDP grows, the worse the economy does. The worse wage earners get, the worse industry gets. And that's because we did some statistics, and all of the growth since 2008 has been in GDP, has been in two statistics, and they're called imputed statistics. One category is the imputed homeowner's rent. If you own a home, you're asked by the Bureau of Labor Statistics and other government statisticians, if you had to rent your house to yourself, how much rent would you be paying? And all of this imputed homeowner's rent is counted as an increase in GDP. The other great increase in GDP is financial capital gains and financial earnings. They do a measure of financial services. And I called the Commerce Department last time I was in Washington. They've stopped meeting with me because they say I always say something that's embarrassing. So they would only read a statement to me over the phone. They said financial earnings are the amount of interest income and financial income that banks make when they make mortgages of 5.25% or credit card loans of 11% or penalty rates of 29% compared to the cost of interest, which is 0.1%. So all of the bank earning, all of what they extract from the economy, other people's debt service, other people's interest is counted as an increase in GDP. So what we're doing is remaking the GDP statistics to treat them the way the classical economists of the 19th century would have treated them. We're treating the financial sector as a subtrahend, as an overhead. And that was just as the focus of Adam Smith, the physiocrats, John Stuart Mill, Marx, and others were to get rid of the landlord class that was a non-productive class that simply extracted absentee rent income. Their role has been taken over by the financial sector today, whose role is also passive, extractive, and yet the GDP, because this negative side of the economy has achieved so much money, it's been able to buy control of the statisticians. This change in the GDP only happened about 10 or 15 years ago. And back then, I was working with a number of groups, and both here and in Canada, in the United Nations, we were all coming up against the bank lobbyists who said, look, the economy's not productive. Factories aren't productive. We're productive because we make the money out of them to extract, to pay to the rich people, and to trickle down. And any politician who disagreed with them did not get the funding. The politicians who applauded were the ones who got the funding, and that's part of the privatization of the political process. So at any rate, the result is that what's counted as a rise in production today is the rise in extraction. It's the rise in what the 1% or the finance, insurance, and real estate, the fire sector, is able to extract from the economy, largely in the two ways that I found. We were trying to make a chart of interest payments, and I couldn't figure out. I looked at the statistics, and if you look at interest payments as a proportion of wage payments and national income, it hasn't changed at all in 20 years. And I called, I called back the Federal Reserve that makes the statistics and the Commerce Department and said, how can this be? I said, what happens when the credit card debtors go into arrears and their charges go up to 29%? They said, oh, we don't count that as interest. We count that as a financial service. And I said, well, how is that a service? They said, that's the service of taking a risk. And I said, taking a risk? They said, yes, and they show it's all in print. They printed sort of a GDP handbook for how to put it together. And they say the role of the economy can't work without bankers taking the risk of lending the money. Now, for instance, when they make a student loan, these are all guaranteed by the government, risk-free loans. And yet that's counted taking the risk. The risk is you may elect another government that changes the rules, basically. And the same thing with mortgages. Every mortgage in the United States below about $500,000 is federally guaranteed by Fannie Mae or Freddie Mac. No risk at all. They're all guaranteed. And if the banks do make junk loans, they're all bailed out with quantitative easing, the $4.3 trillion that the Federal Reserve has monetized, again, in the 8 years of the Obama administration. So essentially, you have risk-free, government-guaranteed extraction of money from the economy, all counted as taking a risk to help the economy produce more, when actually it's shrinking the economy because, as I guess you've all heard me say before, if you have to pay more and more of your income to the banks as debt service, you have less and less to pay for goods and services. And the Federal Reserve just published a report, I think a month ago, saying that 46% of Americans are unable to raise $400 in an emergency. So when the NBC and CBS talk about the stock market going up, making everyone rich, it's not making the people who can't raise the $400 in an emergency rich, because again, I think the upper 1%, or maybe it's 5%, own 87% of the stock market value. So again, when you divide the economy into the fire sector versus the rest, or the 1% or the 5% versus the 95%, essentially you're having the two sides of the balance sheet there. And then you ask, who's the economy run for? Is it run for the positive side of the balance sheet, labor and industry and agriculture? Or is it run for the negative side of the balance sheet, finance, insurance, and real estate, and monopolies, the other form of economic rent? Well, all of classical economics was about economic rent as unearned income. And their idea of social capitalism was a capitalism that's evolving into socialism by freeing economies from the legacy of medieval feudalism, landlords, finance, that is extractive banking, and the monopolies that were created initially to give back to the creditors and the bondholders of England and Holland, other countries, France, in exchange for their tearing up the government debt. So the result is that what you're having today is a repetition of what happened in this whole transfer of the 16th and 17th century, the transfer of property, including the Bank of England, the East-West Indies trading companies, all of the great public infrastructure monopolies were sold off to the bondholders and began to be privatized. You're having another privatization today, and the logic behind this privatization is another form of negative economics, and it negates the mixed economy. As you know today, 40% of the U.S. economy, 50% of most continental European economies are the government sector. The neoliberal economists today count all of this as a dead weight. There is nothing in the national balance sheet for capital formation for government infrastructure because they assume it's all worth zero. Only private companies can create capital in the form of infrastructure, and only it's all measured by the extent to which they can create stocks and bonds against it. In other words, the negative side of the balance sheet defines the magnitude of the positive side of the balance sheet. So there's a whole movement today, as you know, ever since Margaret Thatcher in the 1980s, Ronald Reagan here, and now under Trump, to privatize. And Trump's plan, I'm told, after November is going to be to push his infrastructure plan, meaning give away the infrastructure, all that he can, to his campaign donors for nothing, and let them turn them into monopolies. Let them turn our roads into toll roads. Let them turn the communication system into monopolies to extract as much as you can. You have Betsy DeVos trying to privatize education and get rid of the public education, so that in order to get an education, to qualify for a job, you have to go into so high a lifetime of student debt that you can't afford to take out a mortgage loan anymore to buy a house and start a family. So again, we're having the negative side of the balance sheet define what is productive and what is unproductive, in the economic statistics, so that negative economics will have what it calls an empirical justification, and you can actually measure it. And the theory is that if you can put a decimal point to it, it's real, and that is used to justify, well, that's what they give Nobel Prizes for these days. Well, the whole idea, as you know, in the 19th century, was that America got rich in the same way that Germany, France, and other countries were getting rich by having governments, ever since the medieval period, build the roads, build the postal system, build the hospitals. The conservative Prime Minister of England, Benjamin Disraeli, said health, all is health. We've got to put a health system in. Bismarck in Germany, another conservative, introduced Social Security. All of these ideas were originally the idea that to make a competitive industrial capitalist economy, you needed to lower the cost of living, lower the price of doing business, so that you could undersell other countries. The only country that is shares this rational capitalist approach today is the country I just got back from, which is why I'm hoarse, China, where the government there is making wonderful high-speed railroads of the kind you won't find here. They're providing free education. They're providing the infrastructure. That is why they're industrializing and America isn't. Because America's privatizing the infrastructure, or specifically loading it down with debt to build the cost of providing public services into payment to bondholders, payment to stockholders, management fees of the kind that Bain Capital and money managers extract, that vastly increase the cost of living, that again put a squeeze on the population, because what used to be provided by the productive economy and the government sector freely is now provided at a cost that goes not to the company, not to the means of production itself, the roads and the schools, but to the bondholders and to the stockholders. And it's basically the bondholders. People talk about as if corporations and banks are owned by the stockholders, but they're really owned by the bondholders. That's why the whole key to the junk bond takeover movement, the whole key to the corporate rating movement is bondholders, not stockholders. It's private equity is essentially finance capital working on its own behalf, not on behalf of the people. The whole increase in homeownership in recent years, over 10%, has gone to hedge funds and institutional capital, not even real estate investment trusts, but groups like Blackstone that had bought tens of thousands of apartments more cheaply. So at any rate, you're having the result of this privatization of all of a sudden turning a positive public infrastructure asset into something negative is you're going to have less education, you're going to have fewer people taking the subway service, you're having less education, lower housing, you're having economic shrinkage. And that basically, if you had a realistic picture of the GDP, it would track this economic shrinkage, which is exactly why the bank lobbyists want to come in and reverse the mathematical sign. Now, you could look at property acquisition in the form of this privatization as a buildup of financial fortunes as dispossession. And most people think of dispossession, well, they're expropriating Obama's 10 million homeowners. But the most fortunes have always been made out of the private sector, out of privatizing the public sector, by privatizing the public sector, by taking over the public domain. That's how the great railroad fortunes were made in America. That's if you read Gustavus Meyer's History of the Great American Fortunes, it was all made by privatizing the public domain. That essentially is how the oil and gas and mining industries operate, the forestry industry. You're having basically an expropriation of government and of the public sector, and now it's spread to an expropriation of popular homeownership, as you're having a very sharp rise in absentee ownership. The rate of homeownership in America since Obama has gone down from 68% to 62%, so it's been devastating. No longer is homeownership a way to build up wealth as it did for the middle class for a half century after World War II. Buying a house is a way to get into a lifetime of debt, and getting an education is a way to become poor, not a way to become rich, especially if you go to a profit college and you're a high school graduate and you want at least to get some kind of a academic degree, and you go for one Trump College or any of the other colleges. It doesn't help. You can't get rid of the debt. You can't abolish them, because what the government calls adding to the economy by taking a risk turns out to be risk-free for the bank. The risk is all on the victim who registers for the education. Well, the final aspect of the negative economics, you do hear about budget deficits. The deficits are bad. And yet budget deficits are the only way of pumping money into the economy to help provide it with the means of payment that it needs to grow. So the one aspect of the economy that should be treated positively, money is treated as a debt. All the money, all government money, all official money is technically on the liability side of the balance sheet. It's debt. And as you know, on the balance sheet, you have assets on the left-hand side and liabilities and net worth on the right-hand side. So, I mean, I would prefer to call when government debt that is monetized, you could call it equity money. It's technically net worth money. It's a debt that doesn't have to be repaid, because nobody's going to do today what they did in the 1880s and 1890s and turn in their money for actual metal, for gold or silver, which was sacrificing, as you know, the economy on the cross of gold. It's now being crucified on debt. You don't need gold for that. But again, when they say crucified for debt, that means paid to the savers. The debts are owed to the savers. The savers are the 1% who operate through the finance, insurance, and real estate sector. So essentially, we're back to the point that I began with. The savings of the 1% are the liabilities of the 99%. And if you think of everything in terms of a balance sheet, it'll become, you can see that there's a gainer and maybe a not so much of a gainer. On the other side, every asset has a liability claim against it. If you're thinking of making, of looking at anything in the news, you can think of it in terms of this balance sheet, and you'll see that it's almost always the liability side of the balance sheet that is the key. Well, what that means is that this kind of negative economics of running the economy for the liability side of the balance sheet turns out to be anti-labor. It imposes austerity. The economy for the 95% of Americans has not grown since 2008. They keep talking about it growing because the stock market goes up and housing prices are going up. But that doesn't mean the economy is going up. It's counted as if the economy is going up in the GDP statistics, because although they call it the national income and product accounts, paying a debt does not add to product. Having a given house, a physical structure that you live in, go up in rental value is not a product. That's something that is a cost for the people who increasingly have to rent the apartment. I was completely unable to get this idea across to the New School when I was there. Unfortunately, many of them thought they were Marxists. And back in the 60s and 70s, I had never met a Marxist who had read volume 2 or 3 of Capital. In fact, in the 1940s, I knew all of the Marxist leaders, the leaders of the German Revolution, the Russian Revolution had come to America. I'd go over to their house, and I was a little kid. And I'd usually look at the books that I recognized on their bookshelf, Capital, and I'd open them up, and I'd see they'd never been opened, but they were all there. I think it's like people who have Piketty's book on their bookshelf. You wonder who's got through them. And has this binding ever been stretched? Always an interesting question if you're looking at somebody's house to see how many are just, these are what a smart person should read. I'm a smart person, therefore draw your own conclusions. It was largely for show. And I could not convince these people to talk about Volume 3 of Capital. And as a matter of fact, I just got back from the second Global Marxist Conference at the University of Peking University, where I'm a professor. And the opening and closing speech was given by my friend David Harvey, all about Volume 3 of Capital. And he was saying, look, you're having a Marxist conference here, and you're all talking about, let's have world friendship, and everybody be happy. And, actually Marx was a little beneath the surface. And if you look at Volume 3, it's all about how the tendency of debt in finance is to grow exponentially. And the question is, now that more and more money is being lent out to Chinese to buy their housing, look at Shanghai. Look at the billionaires who are Shanghai real estate developers. All this money is going to spread to the rest of China, looking for somebody to lend to. And the government around that time was talking about letting American banks in to China. And how is an American bank in China, with full owner, not a minority ownership like it was before, but full ownership, how is it going to make a market? And that is by underselling other banks. How do you undersell Chinese banks? By making more and more reckless loans. In this country, they've just changed the law to let community banks be deregulated compared to commercial banks. Let's help the communities. Now, I've been a consultant to community banks in Chicago, and they explained to me, how do they expand their market to make more money? They make more reckless loans to other commercial banks. The year before the bank I worked for went bankrupt, I asked, why are you making a loan to this apartment house? And they said, well, it's twice what it's worth. They think they can kick everybody out, the renters out, and they can turn them into co-ops and load it down with debt and then sell it to the people who are buying the co-ops, like they did in New York, and just add the price on to the debt, and we've got double the price, and all that is ours for nothing, and that pays the bank, and we get all the money. And I said, how long can that work? And they said, well, if we don't make the loan, they will. They went bankrupt the next year, in 2008. So I didn't get any more consulting fees from them, unfortunately. Another negative aspect of today's negative economics. So the point of all this is that the debt problem is simultaneously a savings problem because the debts are owed to the 1%. And the only way to solve it, to solve the debt, to write down the debts, if you write down the student debts, then you're writing down the banks have to take a loss. And if you write down the student debts and say they don't have to be paid, all the big banks go bankrupt. I think that's a wonderful thing, and so does Sheila Bair. We had a discussion. She said in 2008 she wanted to take over the most crooked bank in America, Citigroup. It was bankrupt. It had negative net worth. And she said, we can take it over by the FDIC, and we can make a public bank out of it. And the advantage is they're not going to make junk mortgage loans. They're not going to make crooked loans. But Obama's Treasury Secretary, the bagman, Tim Geithner, was close to the guy who'd become head of Citibank, Rubin, And he said, no, we've got to pay the bondholders. It would be, and essentially, Sheila wrote in her autobiography, I learned it was all about the bondholders. That's the problem. The same problem you had, I'm writing a history of the collapse of antiquity now. I want to read one quotation from what Socrates said. And I was, it's basically a financial history of the debt revolts in Greece and Rome. But in the process, I wanted to see what Plato and Socrates said about it. So near the very outset of Plato's Republic in 380 BC, Socrates is discussing the morality of paying debts. Should you pay debts or not? And Cephalus, a businessman who's living in the commercial Piraeus port district, says that isn't it fair to pay back a debt that you borrowed? And Socrates said, well, is it fair to return a weapon to a man who's become a lunatic? In view of the adverse consequences, paying back a creditor is the wrong thing to do, because what's a creditor going to do? He's going to try to buy the land and expropriate a landholder. He's going to try to reduce a debtor to bondage. The conclusion that financial wealth is destructive. And in Book 4 of the Republic, Socrates says that wealth is just as destructive as poverty. He said, will a potter who's gotten rich still be willing to attend to his art? And will he become idler and more careless? Doesn't he become a worse potter? And what if from poverty he's not even able to provide himself with tools or anything else for his art? He'll produce shoddier works. So from both poverty and wealth, the product of the arts are worse, and the men themselves are worse. Well, that's, imagine, somehow, although I went to the University of Chicago, that's all based on the classics, they never, I missed this the first time I read The Republic. And it turns out it's all about debt and credit and hubris, and wealth leads to hubris. And the whole attempt of Socrates to reform is to prevent the rich people from destroying the economy. Well, they didn't have this problem in Babylonian Sumer. And in about a month or two, I'll be publishing my book of the origins of debt, the first 1,000 years of debt cancellation in Sumer and Babylonia. And every new ruler would take the throne by proclaiming a cancellation of personal debts, mainly agrarian debts. And the advantage of this is that, first of all, he could do what the Chinese government is doing when it cancels debts. You're canceling debts owed to yourself. And it's easy to, nobody's going to kill you for canceling debts owed to yourself. And the other debts were owed to the palace collectors. And by Babylonian times, around Hammurabi's time in 18th century BC, there were more and more wealthy individuals who tried to become rivals of the palace. So the advantage of canceling debts is you wipe out the rival class that's trying to arise to take over the economy, as it succeeded in doing in Greece and Rome. And they did it, and they were able to remain stable by canceling debts. Stability ended when you were no longer able to cancel the debts, and all of a sudden you moved from cyclical cancellation of debt, to progress. Progress means you can't cancel the debts, they build up exponentially. Well, I found the closest approximation in modern times, at least 9th century AD, in Babylonia. And in Babylonia, you had the 9th and the 10th century strong emperors canceling the debts because they didn't want what they called the dinatoi, the same word that Socrates used, from dynasty, dying, power. You didn't want the powerful creditors to be able to have enough money to expropriate, to take the land over, in which case you wouldn't have the landowner serving in the army, you wouldn't have the owner-occupants providing corvée labor to work on the public works. And you had the rich people there doing essentially what they did under the Obama administration and the Trump administration. They said, let's get rid of the government. And at that time, they did it not financially, or they did it militarily. And the wealthy families backed two generals to overthrow the Byzantine governor. Well, finally, the governor, the emperor, defeated the general, and invited him to a meal to sort of celebrate, like people used to do, to celebrate the peace making. And the emperor asked the general, "What can I do to prevent these guys from starting again to fight against my successor?" And Sellus, the chronicler who wrote about this, saying the general gave a response to the emperor that might be surprising to hear from a wealthy general. He said, "You've got to kill them, or you've got to tax them. You've got to make sure that you take away their wealth. You've got," and he proclaimed a debt cancellation and reversed all of the land transfers that had taken place in the last 100 years. You've got to prevent them from getting land, and that is essentially exactly what Socrates ended up proposing in the Republic. He said, you can't have the wealthy people run the government. If you put Betsy DeVos in there, you're going to have hubris, and they're going to overreach themselves, and they're going to destroy the economy. You've got to have public servants that don't have any money and that don't have any property. Yet once you let the property people and the moneyed property in, they're going to destroy the government. And that's book 8 of the Republic. That's a long speech by Socrates. Again, somehow people don't think of Plato and Socrates as talking about this issue. This is what led to it. In the next century, in the 3rd century, you had the revolutions in Sparta. You had even Sparta's king, Agis and Cleomenes, cancel the debts. And the result was that the oligarchies called in armies to defend them. They called in Rome to defend them. There was a half century of debt revolts all through the Peloponnese up to Argos and Corinth. And finally Rome took over the whole thing. And we all know what happened there. The end of debt peonage was serfdom. And that's the model of where our economy is going today. It's the victory of the negative side of the balance sheet.
We are going to move to Q&A, but I do want to ask you one thing, because I think it helps bring your points into more of a relevant current perspective, particularly looking at the distinguishing features of China versus the US. When we recently spoke, I brought up the point that China's private debt to GDP ratio is now at 220%, which is basically the biggest in the history of capitalism. And I basically asked Michael if that was an issue, and he basically said at this current point, it's not. But this threat of potentially the foreign banks, the US and European banks getting into China could totally rearrange that situation. But maybe talk a little bit more about the distinguishing features and how China can essentially.
Here's what I recommended that China do: continue to let the American banks in with 49% of the loans. Make all the loans you want. Give industry as much money as you can. Give real estate as much money, and then proclaim a debt cancellation. You'll cancel the debt to yourself. You can then resell the apartments to the actual occupants at the going rental value, and you'll wipe out the Chinese branches of the American banks, wipe out the entire Western banking system, and you don't have to do it by computer manipulation. It's free market policy. And they didn't think President Xi would go for that. So the result is, however, enough people thought it that in October we're going to have a meeting on fictitious capital in Tianjin University, just to the northwest adjoining Beijing, where I'm bringing my gang over to try to, my Volume 3 gang, to try to promote that idea.
I think we have a lot of questions I can see. So why don't we start over here?
Thank you, Michael Hudson. You recommended reading Volume 3 of Capital. I have been reading it. It's fascinating, the law of the tendency of the rate of profit to decline. I just want to throw out one bizarre development. I'm a legal proofreader. I proofread the highest level of financial documents. I just want people to know that not only are there now hedge funds, that it takes $25 million into the hedge fund, they have like 250-page prospectuses that you cannot understand because they're not written to be understood. And they have one development that is so bizarre. When I was proofreading the documents at the law office, I broke out laughing and I couldn't stop laughing. I don't know whether you've heard about this. They have something called a blank check corporation, where groups of executives simply get together, solicit hundreds of millions of dollars, not indicating what the purpose is, and simply saying they're going to try to achieve certain mergers and acquisitions. They aren't private equity funds. There's something new on the horizon where you ask for money, you list your credentials, you do what you want to do with the money, and if the suckers want the principal back, well, they shouldn't have believed the biographies that these people put in the prospectuses. This is what a criminal country we live in.
So, Michael, I have a question for you with regards to if you were to, Michael Hudson, sorry, real quick. If you were to cancel the debts, if there was to be a debt jubilee in the U.S., I guess the counter argument would be confidence in the U.S. dollar would erode. Other countries, maybe, like the value of the dollar would erode. So what would be like the counter argument to that? And then I understand that, theoretically, people aren't just going to stop trading with the United States, it's a resource-rich country and all that. But so, and it's similar question with China as well. Like if they were to declare a jubilee or things like that, like what are the economic negatives, if you will, if you were to have a debt jubilee, or what are some of the arguments that you hear against that and could counteract?
I don't know anybody who said that the dollar would go down if we canceled the debts. I'll give you the reason in a minute, but the last successful debt cancellation was the German economic miracle of 1947-48. They canceled the debts, and so Germany became debt-free. German industry was able to operate without debt. Imagine if American companies could operate without debt. They would become more competitive. Without debt, housing could be more affordable. The economy would be competitive again. And in terms of foreign governments couldn't sell their dollars for the simple reason the government has now released the documents that I was given in confidence when I visited the White House in 1974. There was a meeting with Saudi Arabia and the U.S. government. And what I was told by the Assistant Secretary of State was, if you don't keep your money in U.S. dollars, we would count that, Saudi Arabia will count that as an act of war, and we'll invade you. So they don't want to be invaded. Of course they're going to keep their dollars.
What about the Petro-UN?
Same thing with, can you imagine Germany or England doing something that would offend the United States? It's unthinkable. But most of all, it would make the economy more productive by canceling the debts. What it would almost force other countries to cancel their debts to be competitive, because countries that did not cancel their debts would become high-cost countries. So Greece could have canceled the debts.
They didn't have a currency, right? They had to wait.
They could have had Jamie Galbraith had a good idea. The central bank had a lot of euro notes that they could have done. He had the idea of, we'll just overprint the euro notes, we'll stamp them like called drachma. Now the advantage is that he would have stamped them and said they're drachma, their own currency. Now these euro notes will be circulating, but he'd do it just in ink. Imagine people going to Greece, buying drachma at a lower price, then going to Germany and putting them into an ATM there and getting real notes back. That's the advantage. You'd completely screw up the whole payment system in Europe. I was all for it. And his face sort of dropped when I said that. That hadn't been his intention. But I said, but that's a surprise benefit. But again, Varoufakis didn't do it. What can I say? They were all things that don't always work out for the best.
I'm looking for women. It's all men who have questions.
I don't know if you addressed this earlier, but could you talk about how the Puerto Rico situation,
Oh, what?
the Puerto
Puerto
Rican
Rico.
bonds, and the Argentinian bonds from a few years ago?
Yeah, obviously, Puerto Rico is a country that can't pay its debts. And as you know, my motto is debts that can't be paid won't be paid. The question is, how won't they be paid? The American financial institutions say, this is wonderful that it can't pay. Now we can say, okay, give us your electric company, give us your public domain, give us your ports, let us do to you what we've done to Greece and Argentina. Give us everything that you have. So now they're trying to use this to figure out how much they can take as a result of Puerto Rico not canceling the debts. And Puerto Rico, although they're U.S. citizens, they don't have the ability to have a bankruptcy like the southern states used to wipe out their debts. So they can't cancel the debts. And the principle here is you don't know how much you can take from them until they begin to fight back. And instead of fighting back, a large proportion who can afford it have just moved to America. I mean, Puerto Rico is essentially unlivable now because yesterday, according to FEMA, they can't sustain another hurricane, and we're right at the beginning of the next hurricane season. So it's obvious the power still isn't on there. The Power Authority was completely corrupt, given to insider dealings. Puerto Rico legally could claim this is an odious debt, and it could have my Greek friends come over who wrote the whole documentation on why Greek debt is an odious debt to come over there. Or they could secede and say they're a sovereign country and repudiate the debt. That would be another. But then they'd lose their citizenship. So I don't know. If you can convince the debtor that somehow they have to pay because it's moral, that's what Socrates is talking about. You've got to get them over the idea that it's the right thing to pay the debt and that society will fall apart if you don't pay the debts. Society only falls apart when you do pay the debts.
You're describing a situation that's going downhill, that's taking money out of the populace. I mean, doesn't that decrease spending, eventually the economy has to contract, we have to get deflation.
Yeah.
There's no good end to this.
That's right. If you want to see what's happening to America, look at what's happened to Greece since the IMF came in, and it didn't write down the odious debts. That literally, I mean, the original debts were faked by Goldman Sachs that came over there that turned out to misrepresent the debts. The result in Greece has been depopulation, shorter lifespans, as we're having in the United States, rising suicide rates, as we're having in the United States.
But demand goes down, so
yes.
so companies can't sell
the
their
stores are all
goods.
closed. When I was in Greece last, we saw all sorts of stores being boarded up. It's almost beginning to look like 8th Street or Upper Broadway. You know, they're all the stores are all closing, or Sears. You know, I mean, that's what's happening here, and people think it's an act of nature, that there's something natural about it, and it doesn't have to be this way. It's really not nature. It's because people don't really understand how the economy works, and they don't understand the distinction between negative and positive economics.
I know you've had your hand up for a while.
Hello, Michael. I would like to ask you a question about how did Adam Smith and Henry George look at and understood free trade, and how it would need to have a land value tax for free trade, for true free trade to exist, and how would it benefit society?
Oh, that's a trick question, because neither understood free trade. They didn't understand that free trade means that the ability of countries to make other countries dependent on you. It was called free trade imperialism. The idea that if England can get other countries not to protect themselves and essentially not to have the government provide basic infrastructure and develop their own industry, that England can charge monopoly prices. Now, you're having that whole thing come to an end in America right now. America promoted free trade when we could produce cheaper than Europe because they were all bombed, and we could undersell them, and we could provide government support to our agriculture, but free trade meant that other countries could not protect their industry as America protected its industry, and they could not protect their agriculture as America would put quotas, import quotas on, and through the World Bank would only give loans for export crops, not for agricultural crops that would compete with American exports. So free trade is a way to make other countries so dependent on you that you can charge a monopoly rent, and instead of exchanging for labor, as Ricardo thought, trade is who is going to get the economic rent, the monopoly rent, from selling goods at a higher price than is actually warranted by the intrinsic cost value, by the fact that other people can't compete and you have a monopoly. Like the Americans have monopolized agricultural trade and are trying to monopolize information technology. Look at these screams that's going up today that China is trying to become independent in information technology. Well, fortunately, you can almost believe that Donald Trump indeed is an agent of Putin, because he realizes that Putin and the Russians don't, not understanding capitalism because they've never read Capital, won't protect their own industry. So Trump says, okay, I'm going to help you protect your own industry. I'm going to force you to protect it. I'm going to put sanctions on all your industrial goods and your agriculture, so you'll have to protect industry and develop your own self-sufficiency just like we did, in spite of yourself. So fortunately, Trump is acting as the Russian national protectionist by preventing free trade imperialism from destroying the Russian economy as the neoliberals had hoped to do.
Professor Hudson, I have a question specifically regarding a theoretical student loan debt boycott. If you had a significant number of student borrowers refusing to repay their loans, specifically in regard to the asset-backed securities that corporations like Navient are selling, do you think that a debt boycott could trigger a liquidity crisis on Wall Street?
No, they'd foreclose on the property of your parents. Or you'd get in a lot of legal trouble because you're legally responsible for these. A boycott, you'd essentially be making yourself sacrificial victims, and of course, that would be counted simply as a default. And if enough of you did it, the default rate would be high enough to make a difference. But you've got to make that the only way you can do it without being destroyed by the federals coming in and grabbing your property, or any of your parents who've countersigned for your debts, is to make it a political issue with politicians. I don't know any politicians who are really willing, as a group, to back it. That's the problem. You're screwed. So the boycott should really just come in the form of a default. What are you going to do? Well, they will garnish your salaries if you make any salaries. They will try, and it'll grow exponentially at a rate that'll highly benefit the banks. The banks want you to do it. The banks probably have agent provocators. I assume you're being well paid by a bank to suggest that, because the bank, if you do that, the banks get to charge a penalty rate and get an enormous amount from the government because it's all guaranteed. That's how they take the risk, that you may fight back and elect politicians to change all of this. But now you'll make a student boycott would make a lot more money for the banks.
We don't have any money.
What?
We don't have any money.
That's an advantage. Yeah, if you don't have money, then you can say you're doing it for a good social purpose, and you get a two-way benefit from it. So yes, of course the debt shouldn't be paid, but you need to get mobilized.
I'm not sure if you saw it, but Stephanie Kelton and a couple of our other colleagues at the Levy Institute just came out with a really good paper on the macroeconomic effects of student debt cancellation. They basically found it would have a net positive on the economy because people would have more money to pay for housing or buy a car or whatever it might be. We don't want people buying too many cars.
That's not.
But
Isn't it paying the government paying off the loans to banks? Isn't that what it is?
To my knowledge, it's a federal debt cancellation.
It's all guaranteed.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So they'll pay it off.
Right.
Yeah.
Which is different than cancellation, right?
No, it's just a pure cancellation. Maybe reframe your question. I'm not sure if I'm understanding.
Well, as I understand.
Nullification.
Yeah.
Cancellation.
Right.
Yeah. In this case, the government would pay the banks the loans.
Yes.
And then they would forgive the loans to the students.
No, they don't forgive them. No, the government collectors will come after you. And I'm sure that some equivalent of Betsy DeVos will be in charge of hiring the collectors to come after you, or whoever your countersigners are.
So how do we get into another FDR then? What do we got to do? We have to go all the way down to the hole and charge?
I would be arrested if I gave you a
No,
answer.
no, let's go down.
By whom?
Thank you. Prof. Hudson, you spoke about China and the role of Chinese banks giving out a lot of loans inside China. But recently the developments in the world have also been China as a lender for international purposes. Many countries are seeking aid from China to get loans from China instead of getting them from the IMF or the US or the World Bank. You follow me?
Can you
Maybe just, yeah.
tell me what a question was, if you could hear.
Repeat it again.
Okay. You spoke about China.
Yes.
The role of Chinese banks giving out increasing amounts of loans inside
Yes.
China. Now, outside of China, other countries have been tendering to China to get loans as well for development and other purposes. I come from Bolivia, okay? So we have been partnering with China for this purpose instead of going to the IMF or going to the US for political reasons mainly. So
When you say we, is it a private corporation or the Bolivian government?
Country, the government.
The government?
Yes, and the same has been going on in Venezuela and Ecuador and other countries.
You've been making loans to Chinese
No.
businesses?
They have,
The other way.
they have been,
China makes loans to you?
Yes, to
Uh-huh.
our government. Okay, so we don't have to go to the IMF or the
Good,
World Bank,
good.
so on and so on.
In what currency do they make these loans?
I'm not sure about
I think
that.
it's in their own currency, and they don't want to denominate them in debt. When I was in China, for the first time, they insisted in paying me in these these red Chinese currency that I then had to take to the bank. So I think they're trying to denominate everything they do in their own currency now.
I think
And then you can do it. So yeah, they expect you to pay them on the terms. You can be sure that their mentality is to collect everything that is owed to them.
Yeah, my question is like, what thoughts do you have on the development that this will take worldwide, since many countries are becoming interested in looking for China for aid? What does it
I'd
mean
certainly
for
rather
aid?
borrow from China because they won't send in the Marines to collect. And the Americans would send in the Marines. And I don't think the Chinese engage in targeted assassination, which the United States does to people who can't pay their debts or who don't save their money in dollars. So China, so far, I would certainly recommend it. I mean, obviously, they want to get as many people into the non-dollar area as possible. And if you email me, I can talk in greater detail. Do you work with the government?
No.
Oh, okay.
No, I don't. It's just a question. Should we expect something from America in this regard? What does that mean for you?
For who?
American, for American government, for American banks? Is that
Oh, you mean
something that
when you
worries
say
them?
you mean I'm an American.
Like an economic hitman.
Right. Well, it means that people want to avoid the dollar trap. They want to avoid. If you're talking about negative economics, certainly the most negative institution in the world is the World Bank, followed by the IMF. I mean, that's negative economics incarnate, and you want to get free of that whole system.
If we no longer allow foreign countries and individuals to buy our debt.
Oh, we love them to
the
buy
way
our
we
debt
used to.
because we can just stiff them.
No, that's not what I mean. If we no longer allow them to buy our debt. Like during World War II, it was financed by American bond, Americans exclusively, through the bonds and so on. And when we changed the law to allow them, what I'm saying is if we went back to the way it used to be, would that be good for the economy or wouldn't it make any difference?
I don't understand what you mean by how it used to be. Do you know what he meant?
When we didn't allow them to buy our bonds.
Well, I'm not aware. Of course, I'm not aware that we never let other people buy our bonds. Everybody You want as many people as possible to buy your bonds.
Well, there was a time when foreigners couldn't buy them. Our national debt is what I'm talking about.
I'm not even aware of
They
that.
couldn't buy.
They could have always made an American company to buy. I mean, the British held American bonds. Dutch did. I'm not sure who couldn't buy them. I'm just not aware of that.
Now, I'm an economist, I'm sorry, I'm not an expert at all on finance, but I'm claiming that you're a real economist who tried to extract from this financial side of it. But here's my question. It seems to me, I'm long gone, that there's a misunderstanding of that. That to me, one reason the neoliberals have such a hold on things is the belief that deficit is a bad thing. And we have to be careful because from a rhetorical standpoint, it certainly sounds bad you have a deficit. You want. So I just wish you'd comment on that because as a Keynesian thinker to some extent, we know that we need as borrowers to match savings. So I just like your comments on this more conventional view that I have of this point, I suppose. Are there misunderstandings about debt and deficit that lead to bad results?
Well, if the government, if the government would repay its debt, there wouldn't be any money, because money is debt. That's the important thing to see. So the reason that the neoliberal think tanks criticize government debt is they want people to rely entirely on the commercial banks. That was Clinton's program in the 1990s. He said, if the government doesn't run a deficit and pump money into the economy, then there's only one source of supply of money. My donor class, the banks, are going to lend. So that's why he was convinced to run deficits are bad, meaning borrowing from banks are good. And the difference is, of course, when governments run a deficit, it used to be, before Obama, you spend money into the economy. And when banks lend money, they lend it against property, against the balance sheet, against real estate, homes, corporations, for completely different reasons than governments. And you can't cancel debts when they're owed to the private people as easily as you can do when they're owed to you as the government.
Yeah.
A question. Everybody talks about the gross national product, but doesn't all that really measure is how much money we spent in a given year? In other words, what I'm saying is, isn't it a fraudulent metric for determining living standards? So they'll say the GDP is whatever it is, but all that they've really said is, well, we spent this much money this year. And does that have anything to do with actual reality? Because what I've heard, Dylan Ragland brings this up in one of his books, that it's a wrong metric because all you're measuring is what you're spending. It's like the tachometer on a car. You're talking about how fast the engine is running, but it's not really telling you whether you're getting anywhere.
Okay, you've just given us today's oxymoron, financial product. The pretense that something that's negative is actually a product. That's exactly the fallacy underlying the balance sheet. It's not a product at all. It's a claim on a product. A financial product is a claim on somebody else's production. Somebody else has to do the work to earn the money, to pay the interest that gives market price, I won't say value, to the financial product.
Do we have any other questions?
And Michael wants to say something.
Oh, Mike, yeah, of course.
When I think about accounting, I think about great schools that have good programs for teaching people about how to write fiction. And that fictional writing continues in our accounting system, which is why so many banks would die and leave other people empty. And there's a book I mentioned to Michael before, which discussed the creation of the Constitution being run predominantly by bankers. And they were very secretive about it. All the windows in Philadelphia had to have shades pulled down so no one could look in and see what was happening. And we came up with the Constitution. And it's really weird because one of the basics of the Constitution was to keep slavery in place. Even the Star Spangled Banner has a couplet, and I don't remember exactly, I can find it on the computer, but it's a story that neither knaves or slaves, if they try to escape, they're going to be dead in the ground. That's the Star Spangled Banner.
How do they come to leave that out, that verse at the ball games?
I don't think they knew about it.
I think that's what a lot of athletes should begin singing. They should sing that verse at the ball games to remind people what it's all about.
We have 4 minutes, so if we have any other questions, I'd like to just take them all at once, and then we can decide, which one to. But if not, we can wrap up.
Here.
Yeah.
No, just I wish you could explain a little bit more about the process of debt cancellation, because supposedly we live in creditism. Economy lives on credit, and if you produce debt cancellation, you are killing the core machine of the economy, supposedly, right? Which is credit, because credit is what keeps the industry. Credit keeps people consuming, and consumption is what moves the industries around. So if you produce debt cancellation, basically you are killing the credit. So how companies are going to get new credit for producing when the bankers that produce the generated credits are going to be afraid of giving more credit?
Repeat the last part of that. I didn't catch that.
What's the question?
When you produce debt cancellation,
Yes.
okay, basically you're telling bankers not to give more credit because they're going to risk.
No, they'd begin making credit the next day, because once you cancel the debts, now you're able to run up debts all over again. So you just have new people making the loans.
And all credit is
New people.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. The banks will be back in business the next day.
But those new people know the risk that eventually the debt are going
Not necessarily. I mean, it goes inside. It builds up until the debts can't be paid, and then it's all there's a crisis, and it's wiped out, and then you begin all over again. This used to happen every 11 years or so in the 19th century. They go bankrupt, you begin again. When I was at Chase, we were told that Chase prefers to lend money to businesses that have gone bankrupt because they've had a bad experience and they've learned from it.
Yeah. Yeah. I will get you. Yeah.
To what degree, if any, would sovereign money solve this problem of, say, the quantity of, since credit functions to pump up the quantity of money in the money supply, if you replace that credit with sovereign money, positive money?
Well, the great example of sovereign money is quantitative easing. The banks would love sovereign money if it's all used to pay the banks. So sovereign money really would only work after you have a debt cancellation. You don't want to create money to enable debts to be paid to the banks. That would just be facilitating the existing status quo. So that would be how to do it, and how to do it better in the future.
We have time for one more. I know your hand has been up for a while.
As a liberation theologian, I'm interested in your work on debt forgiveness, and I'm anxious to read it. And I'm wondering if you draw any theological, religious, faith conclusions for
Sure.
a country that considers itself Christian.
Yeah, Jesus' first sermon in Luke 4 was, he said he had come to, he unrolled the scroll of Isaiah and said, I have come to proclaim a clean slate. That's why he was put to death. And that's what my book goes all into, how the Jubilee year was all based on, word for word, on the Babylonian debt cancellations when the Jews returned, some of the richest exiles returned from Babylonia. That was what Jesus' message was. And the only example of his using violence in the whole Bible is through the moneylenders out of the temple. So, I mean, to me, that was what the original Christianity was all about. But later, a few centuries later, when by the time it began to gain momentum, they just sort of gave up and they said, okay, the clean slate's only going to come at the end of history, at the day of judgment. We can't achieve it in our world.
Yeah.
But that's exactly the topic of my book.
So Jesus was a socialist economic justice activist who wanted to cancel the people's debts. By the way, Michael's that point in particular has, I think it's near complete
Yeah, I'm told that
consensus
today
from the
they finished
Syriologists
resetting
and
the title.
biblical
What's it
scholars.
called?
Yeah.
And forgive them their debts. It's all about Babylonian clean slates, the Jubilee year.